Hi, this is Emma John, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jam Along, the podcast for anyone and everyone who plays bluegrass.
So my guest on Bluegrass Jam Along this week is Emma John. Emma's a writer and editor for The Guardian and Observer, former deputy editor of Observer Sport Monthly and the Wisden Cricketer, and in 2008 was the first woman ever to win a Sports Journalism Award. She's also a producer on the wonderful podcast The Breakdown. But the reason Emma's here today to chat to us is about her wonderful book, Wayfaring Stranger, A Musical Journey in the American South, which I read and I absolutely loved, and I think you all will too. But what makes me particularly fascinated by this book is that it's written by a Brit immersing herself in the world of bluegrass, which, for obvious reasons, if you can hear my accent, resonates with me quite a lot. So, Emma, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
I guess the obvious question is why bluegrass? How did this come about? But with a sort of second part of, was it intended as a book from the start, or did it turn into a book as you went?
That's a very good question. It's a little bit of both, because what happened was I had not played my violin since I was in my early 20s. I'd actually trained classically, and I'd gone to Guildhall School of Music and Drama and done Saturday school, and was taught by a very committed, passionate Serbian violin teacher who thought he had to turn me into a professional musician, because that's what people do at this particular music college. Obviously, unfortunately, that's not really what I wanted to be. So there was a bit of a tug in two directions. And I enjoyed playing the violin very much when I was young. But when I didn't go into it professionally, I actually stopped enjoying playing it at all, really, because I sort of had been sort of almost trained for nothing, really. And so I put it aside and didn't play it for a good 10 years, which, considering, how much that instrument had been part of my life when I was a teenager, was extraordinary, really. It was kind of like, having your best school friend, and then just, one day sort of walking out of their life and then not really picking up the phone to them for a very long time. And so I hadn't really done anything. And of course, the longer it goes on, the more guilty I feel about the fact that I haven't communicated with my violin in a very long time. And so the less I'm actually inclined to do it. And then in my early 30s, a couple of friends who were quite musical, one of them had started playing banjo, and so he'd started picking a bit with a guitar playing friend of ours. And they had said, "Oh, we know you play violin. Would you kind of like lay some fiddle over these country songs we're playing?" And to be honest, I had no background in country music. I mean, I genuinely, I couldn't. I would have struggled to name you more than one Johnny Cash song. I mean, it was that bad. I didn't even know the obvious. But when I mean, it's that thing where, I'd learned, I'd been taught, I'd been drilled, in fact, to sort of have quite a good ear, at music college. So, country fiddle lines, a lot of them, especially on the big kind of mainstream songs, they're not super hard. And, so I picked them up quite quickly, and funnily enough, found this quite enjoyable, getting back on the horse and playing a bit of simple fiddle, and everybody thinking it sounded great.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, oh, fantastic. And because my friend Ben was a banjo player, he liked to bandy this word bluegrass around. And I'll be honest, it was about the same time that Mumford & Sons were coming out with their first album, and I liked them, and because they had a banjo, people talked about them as bluegrass as well. And so I, completely not really appreciating or understanding what bluegrass was, I decided I would quite like to play bluegrass fiddle. And I had this sabbatical from my day job at The Guardian, because this is a very lefty newspaper, The Guardian, and they have this great thing where every 4 years you work there, they'll give you a month's paid sabbatical. And so, I thought, well, what can I do with this month? What could I, Some people like to go and learn a language. Some people repaint their house. Some people just spend time with their kids. I thought, well, I've got back into the fiddle. I could treat it like learning a language. I could go and kind of do a sort of immersive month in the place where they play bluegrass, and I could try and learn there. And so I flew to North Carolina, knowing absolutely nothing about the place. And as it turned out, I arrived and went to a jam my very first night and realized, yes, I don't actually know what bluegrass is, because the thing that we were playing sounded nothing like Mumford and Sons. And and it all sounded, quite Irish, and it was all jigged, or it sounded to me, to my uneducated ear, like kind of very, very difficult Irish sort of fiddle. And I was like, I don't know how to do this at all. But funnily enough, I was only there a week, and within a week, having never wanted to write a book about anything before, I mean, I genuinely had sort of resisted people telling me, "Oh, it's about time in your journalism career that you wrote a book." I said, "No, I'm not writing a book for no reason. It would have to be something I really wanted to write about." And within a week of being in North Carolina, I was so fascinated by not just the music, but really the culture around it, I think. And the extraordinary things that you very quickly learn about it. And for me, one of those things, for example, was the difference between bluegrass and old time. I mean, I just thought, this is great. Not only are these two different musics that really come from the same place, but they also have these completely opposite cultures. One's the lefty version, one's the righty version. One's very, very sort of deep trad, and one is very influenced by the folk revival of the 70s. And this is just wonderful. Somebody should write about this. Oh, I know, I'm a writer, I should write about this. And so within a week, I knew that I wanted to write a book. And then actually it took me another few years to get that book deal, because as you've mentioned, being a Brit is not common, for bluegrass fans. And so it was quite hard to persuade a publisher that you could write a good book about this obscure American music that British people weren't particularly into. So I was playing for a good few years before I finally got the book deal and finally got to go and spend what turned into about a year of over there playing fiddle.
And it's funny you say that, because, the having to convince people to let you write. There's the last sort of 15, 20 years, the book market in the UK has been awash with Brits going to stay somewhere else in the world, learn the culture, absorb the culture, And if that happens to be Provence or somewhere in Italy or somewhere in the Spanish mountains, then that's just there's so many books like that around. And the idea that it was harder to be able to write that kind of book about somewhere non-European just because there's a sort of bluegrass music element about it is sort of hilarious, because there's shelves and shelves of those kinds of books out there.
I know. Well, that was the funny thing. I mean, that was the only thing that sort of put me off my own writing when I was doing the book, was I was thinking, does the world need this book? Really, I knew very much that I kind of, the book for me was an excuse. It was a conduit to go and take a year off work and play music and travel and meet amazing new people and make lifelong friends. And the book was kind of my ticket to do that. And so there was a weird sort of guilt feeling, as when it came to it, that was like, does the world need another journalist goes somewhere and learns about a culture other than her own and ends up enjoying it, but in the end I was quite pleased with it. So I think it's all right. I think I got away with it.
Well, I think what makes the difference, like with any great travel book, is that it's always about two journeys going on at the same time. And one is a physical journey somewhere to be somewhere else and do something else. But the other one is very much an inner journey. And the sort of the story of the book is your inner journey from being a musician who plays music at a very high level, but has a whole other world of music to understand. And there are revelations and epiphanies along the way. And it's that inner journey that stops it from just being a Brit abroad, isn't it? That's the real narrative in many ways. We'll be right back with you just after this. Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins. If you're attending the NAMM show in January, stop by the Collings booth to say hello to the team, get hands-on with their selection of customised acoustics and electrics, and check out some exciting new prototypes they're working on for 2024. They'll also have a few of their world-class artists on hand demoing various instruments. And if you can't attend, don't forget to follow their Instagram and Facebook accounts throughout the show for photos, videos, and the latest news. Collings guitars are hand-built from the Sound Up in Austin, Texas. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. If one of your 2024 resolutions is to improve as a musician, Peghead Nation is the place to go. They have 65 streaming video courses for guitar, mandolin, banjo, fiddle, dobro, bass and ukulele from some of the leading names in acoustic music. Courses cover bluegrass, old time, Irish music and swing, plus lessons dedicated to improvisation, theory and ear training. Your first course is just $20 a month and you can add more for $10. Try any course free for a month with the promo code JAMALONG. Make 2024 a year of more music at pegheadnation.com.
Yeah, and I think that really, that the fact that all that happened to me sort of surprised me, if I'm honest. I knew it would be hard. I wasn't under any illusions that it would be hard to go and learn bluegrass fiddle because it's a very difficult style to master. And most of my teachers would say, well, you never master it. In fact, Matt Glazer, who was my main teacher, said you don't ever master it. You master it each day. That's the only way that you can kind of, you can feel any sense of achievement, because every day you have to come back and learn it all over again, essentially. So I knew that technically it would be difficult. But I think what was really hard was because the two styles of playing, from classical to anything folky, really, are so different. One is perfectionism. One is really underscored by perfectionism, which was very much the training and teaching I had. You're given a set of notes, you're given a set of instructions, and you have to deliver that as absolutely perfectly on cue as you can. And musically as well. Obviously, musicality is a huge part of that. But you start with you got to get the notes right, and you got to be in tune. Whereas fiddle bluegrass was so different. I mean, there was I even though I had read and understood the history of the fiddle as a rhythm instrument, essentially as a dance instrument, there to keep a beat and keep people dancing, I didn't really appreciate that that's something that comes from within the fiddler, and that sense of beat and groove is, you have to have that. And I absolutely did not. I mean, everything I learned about violin and beat came from following somebody waving a stick and keeping to that, and being a follower, being a very, very dedicated follower. Whereas this is like, to get the bluegrass groove, you've got to have it in you. You've got to create it. You've got to kind of like own it. And I did not have that at all. Again, as Matt Glazer would be the first to say. And then, of course, the second element is improvisation. You go from one style of play that, means you just have to memorize music, to one where you have to be making it up. And in bluegrass, you've got to be making it up and improvising at extraordinary speeds. And I think one of the biggest revelations that I have in the book, is that actually even learning, it's very difficult for people to teach you in a short way. If you don't have that background, it's very difficult for people to teach you what improvisation actually is, because what I was essentially doing was kind of trying to make something new every single time I picked up the fiddle, but not really understanding that bluegrass is a musical language, and you need to know the basic words and phrases in order to put them together, and in order to be able to improvise at speed, because you're not being entirely original every time. You're being original in the way that you put this, in the way that you speak the language. You're saying a sentence maybe that's never been said before, but you're not inventing words. The words are there, the phrases and the idioms are there. already, and that's what you need to be able to kind of string together. And that was the hardest. It still frustrates me that I only realised that about 2/3 of the way through my year of playing bluegrass. I'm like, oh my goodness! It was something the Kruger Brothers said to me. They're such kind people, and we sat down and had a long chat. And they were, I can't remember if it was Jens or Uwe who said it, but one of them said it, and it's just like, if somebody had said that to me right at the start, I could have achieved a lot more by now. I'd have got a lot further.
But there wouldn't have been as good a book in it. These are sort of life lessons, really, aren't they? That idea of like so many of the things you said there, like the idea of understanding beat as a sort of intellectual concept you can follow, and having it in you as a thing that you can carry and move around with and play with, and the idea about perfectionism versus expressing something. But like, there's so many parallels there for life that, and you have to learn your lessons again every day. That's what I love about this kind of music, because there isn't a score. You can't go back to the correct version of Cherokee Shuffle or Whiskey Before Breakfast, or like, everybody plays them slightly differently. And so that's massively liberating eventually. But at first it's like, well, what, but how does it go? Like, what's the actual tune? And you just have to sort of work it out in the end.
Yeah. Or you just, you make Kenny Baker your god, which is what I did. It seems to have worked for a lot of other people. So yeah, I was just like, I'm just going to be a Kenny Baker style bluegrasser. I'm not going to try and, I don't have enough time here to try and invent my own style. I'm just gonna do whatever he does, play his notes.
And this is the thing, is that you sort of realise that you can. It's exactly as you're saying. You can learn things and sort of string them together to get you through until you can work out bits that you want to add to that, and bits that you want to change, and bits that express who you are. But it is so much a language where you sort of think, how do people think that fast? How do people think that many notes at a time? And they're thinking phrases and licks and ideas, and something new will come out all the time. But this sense that
this is it. I think there's a mythology that makes it hard to learn. It's very interesting. I sort of assumed a little bit that bluegrass would be quite a closed community, and it would be hard to break in, and they would be very suspicious of an outsider and a Brit. And in fact, the opposite was true. Bluegrassers are very, very keen, I think, to share what they know, because it's it's a small subgenre, and they're very excited. Anytime anybody shows an interest, they want to tell you. It's the same thing for me with cricket. I loved cricket since I was a teenager. And if any of my friends, who are all completely bored by the idea of cricket, show even the slightest, interest in one element of it, I will, jump in there with both feet, in order to, hoping that this will be the time that I explain something to them and they suddenly say, oh, what a brilliant game it is. Yes, absolutely. But despite the fact that I think bluegrassers are very, very good at teaching and very keen always to pass on the traditions, I also do think that there is so much mythology around the music that it makes it very hard to get to the truth. I think it's a music that is based on so much falsehood and so much bravado. It loves its own sense of self, and I don't want to gender it, she says, because she's just about to massively gender it. But I do think it came out of a very, very macho place and time, a group of, and its father was a man who was incredibly, a sort of incredibly big and quite dominant character, who very much kind of wanted to present himself to the world as this this kind of like all-knowing father of bluegrass, as I don't know whether Bill Monroe called himself that, but I know that he enjoyed it. Let's face it, he never said no, it's not just about me. We must talk about everyone else as well. No, he loved it. He loved his own mythology, and I think that is baked into the culture, or at least the heritage, if not the contemporary culture of bluegrass. I think bluegrass has changed a lot, and where it's going in the future is much more inclusive and accessible to all sorts of people. But it's a show-offy music, and it is designed to impress you, and that really can kind of keep you away. That can make you feel like, I'll never be able to do this. And I think that improvisation goes into that, because everyone loves the idea and the mystique that they're just coming up with this stuff, that they are inventing every note again, and aren't they brilliant? And so I don't think people necessarily kind of are really very honest about how the mechanics of it work sometimes, because they'd rather it all just looks like a gift from God.
And that's it. There's one of the themes that's really emerged from doing this podcast is just that idea that I had certainly at the beginning of it. There's this race of superhuman people who live on Bluegrass Mount Olympus, wandering around with a drink in their hand, having arrived at the final destination, going, "Isn't this glorious? Aren't we super?" And they're not. They're just people who've been doing it longer than we have, and worked hard and applied the talent they had, but work incessantly together. And it's been really lovely hearing people talk about that on the podcast, saying like, we're all on the same path. I'm much further down it than you are, but it's the same journey we're all on. Because there definitely can be an element of, and it can happen with all sorts of art forms, but there can be an element of bluegrass that's it's a bit like gymnastics. It's a bit like fastest finger first kind of that. And it doesn't always convey a melody when you're doing that. It'd be about the book equivalent would be like saying the best novels are the longest ones with the most words in them, which is obviously nonsense. But when you sort of dig in and talk to people, there are definitely so many people who are like, I signed up for guitar lessons with Bryan Sutton on the Artist Works platform, and I thought he was going to teach me loads of cool stuff to play. And what he actually told me to do first and foremost was make a nice noise and play something people can tap their feet to. Like, having a groove and having something to say is more important than how fast you can do it. And that will come in time. The rest of it, you can work on that. But like fast, flashy licks aren't what I'm going to teach you first. And that was sort of a revelation. And it was really sort of eye-opening for me.
Yeah, definitely. And so my first, the first thing that I did on this particular, when I went to write the book, the first thing I did was I went on one of Pete Wernick's camps. He holds one just ahead of Merlefest each year. And by this stage, I'd been visiting North Carolina, every year for a few years. So I had some good friends around, and I had a good friend not far from Wilkesboro who I still good friends with. And I go and stay with her. And I was going in from there to Pete's camp, and he is very much of that ilk. That's just like he wants people to feel, he really, I would say he almost wants to like set aside musical ability, because he just wants everyone to be able to sit in a jam and have a good time. That's what he feels that bluegrass, really is and is good for, I suppose. It's a very, I like it because it's sort of naughty to say these words on something that Americans might be listening to, because they'll probably have a fit, but it's almost quite a socialist principle to bluegrass that I really, really appreciate, and that of course should be there. I mean, folk music, every kind of folk music, is the whole point is it's about community and solidarity and democracy and sitting around together. And everyone being welcome, and the American campfire is a place for that, and something that is at the heart of the music, and that does mean that ability, or lack of it, shouldn't ever stop you, shouldn't ever put people off. And I loved that about Pete's approach. It was all I want to start with is, if we can get you to a place where you can play the tune recognizably, then you're contributing to a jam,
Yeah, and I think actually bluegrass is a form of music compared to pop or rock or classical, where you've got the performers and you've got the audience. And bluegrass and a lot of folk music, that distinction is much more blurred, isn't it? And a lot of the audience are also performers or also play in their spare time, and they understand that sort of crossover between, and maybe that's partly because they're just smaller, less commercial musics as well. But there's definitely that shared sense of we're all part of this same thing that you don't necessarily get.
Which is really interesting, because that's not necessarily what it was meant to be. I mean, I find that really interesting. I'm not sure whose history I would go to on this. I mean, probably Neil Rosenberg, because he is to me, he's a definitive historian of bluegrass. But my impression from researching the history, which I did quite a lot while I was writing my book, was that really the people, if you're looking at Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys, the intention was never to create the intention was not to create a kind of music that everyone would play. No, like bluegrass was about, and his whole style and his whole stage presence was about, it was about impressing people with what he could do. And if anything, there was a kind of frustration and, what grew to be an annoyance if people took his brand of music and started messing around with it and doing their own thing with it. And so I think historically, really, it's interesting, that campfire side of it. It was almost unavoidable because it had already come out of a folk tradition anyway. So it was always going to be unlikely that it was going to completely divorce itself from that. But it could have done. Rockabilly, for example, which is not that different a kind of music, is not a jamming music. Rock and roll is not a jamming music. So it's not that I think that, again, you'd need to talk to the real bluegrass historians about this. Fred, who's just written that book about industrial bluegrass, he would know. But I think that circumstance sort of contributed to bluegrass as a picking music. I think the fact that who was it who set up the original camp with Monroe? His name begins with C, and I've totally forgotten it. And he's really important. My friend Trevor will be so disappointed in me that his name has not just come to. But anyway, there was a famous bluegrass festival at Roanoke, which was really kind of the start of the bluegrass festival, and that, I think, was where the picking tradition came from. More than anyone just kind of hearing Bill Monroe's music, a culture grew up around it, and so I think that I think it is really interesting. I think it has grown its own tradition, which I find fascinating, and I think is probably half of the problem of the kind of divisions and conflicts you get in bluegrass today, is that people have different ideas of what that tradition is. And it's if you think about it, it's such a relatively young tradition. It's not even 100 years old. That people are still creating it and claiming it for their own, really.
Well, I've been sort of mulling over since I read the book, like what possible connection there could be between cricket and bluegrass. And just as you talk, it sort of occurs to me that there's some real parallels. Like, both of them obviously really reward geekery and nerding out and knowing all the facts and all the history, and both like cricket is often watched by people who also play it in their spare time. But I think maybe more than that, there's a constant tension between tradition and progress in bluegrass. And like cricket, there's Test cricket, which the purists will see as the version of cricket that should always be played and nothing else should ever be played. And there's the T20s and the hundreds, and that's what's bringing the money in and bringing the people in and bringing the eyeballs and getting the kids into it. And all the old fogies are going, but that's not proper cricket. And in the same way that people are going, Billy Strings isn't proper bluegrass. It's not Flat and Scruggs. So it's maybe there's a universal thing that we do with things we love, where we just get a bit baffled when people don't quite love them in the same way we do. Rather than going, isn't it great? We all love this thing. We get a bit defensive.
Yeah, and it is, and tradition in itself is it's sort of a weird, bonkers thing because the whole point about bluegrass is that when it started, Bill Monroe was doing something completely new, avant-garde, even a little bit kind of, offensive, like sonically offensive. It was, not everyone loved bluegrass when it started. I mean, not everybody loves bluegrass now, let's face it. But when it started, it was too much for some people. It was, who are these young men tearing up, these instruments? And then every generation, and we're not even talking generations as in sons to fathers, daughters to mothers. We're talking, just waves. We're talking from Bill Monroe to Flat and Scruggs, who were in his own band, every new incarnation to Jim and Jesse, they all did something different with it. It was mutating and evolving from like day one, practically. The Osborne brothers, putting electric into it, doing a Dylan, all this stuff. It's like that was happening in the 60s. I mean, we're not talking like, it's funny that it's funny. And I think a lot of young, really serious hotshot musicians, hotshot bluegrassers today find it funny and ironic that there should still be a sort of preservative, protectionist approach to bluegrass. Bluegrass can only be this thing because the whole history of bluegrass from the mid 20th century onward has pushed its boundaries. It's an experimental music. It always has been, and it's going to continue to be like that. It's that's why I don't have a problem with bands like Billy Strings being called bluegrass, if that's what he wants to call it. I mean, he's clearly like one of the best bluegrass pickers in the world. The fact that what then comes out of his band doesn't sound like, doesn't sound like traditional bluegrass doesn't matter to me at all.
No, and I saw them in a tiny venue in London a while ago, and they finished the set around one mic, and it sounded like bluegrass to me. Like, they can do that. They don't choose to do that all the time, but it's there if they want it. And I spoke to the mandolin player Tristan Scroggins a while ago for the podcast, and he sort of pointed out that the whole point of bluegrass becoming what it was that Bill Monroe was progressive and did something new, and Earl Scruggs was progressive and did something new, and this was what we now think of as this tradition, which probably only lasted for about 2 years, was born out of people doing things nobody had ever done on those instruments before.
Yeah. And I think it's funny, isn't it? Because we sort of talked about bluegrass as being like a language. And I think it is. I think like a language, it will evolve. I speak English and the Elizabethans spoke English. We would have struggled to understand each other because of our different vocabularies and our different accents. But we still speak the same language. I can sit down and read Shakespeare and, pretty much understand what you say with a little bit of help from a Cliff Notes or whatever. We're really bad as humans. It doesn't matter what it is. We are really bad at letting things evolve and change. We struggle with it. I think it's because we both live so short and so long. We think we live long, but 70 years is actually, nothing. And it's certainly not enough time to really kind of get a handle on how the world is going to change.
Yeah, and it's like sort of running the risk of going a bit deep on this, but like one of the things that struck me about the book is, yes, it's a book about you going to North Carolina to live and play bluegrass, but it's really like the journey of learning to improvise and your journey. It's really a story about learning to be vulnerable. And that whole thing around tradition versus progression is like to have confidence in what the thing you love is or who you are or whatever. And you get your value from what you think is important, not what everybody else says is important. So that's one of the things I thought was really beautiful about the book, because it was essentially just learning to be open to things and get things wrong. That's what learning to improvise is. And that's what life is. And it's one of the hardest things to do, is to sort of just be able to be vulnerable and get things wrong in a public space. And if you're going to learn to jam, you're going to have to do that week in, week out.
Yeah, that's really true. I think that is really true. And I think a lot, it's interesting because a lot of that is stuff that I don't think I would have ever got to a place where I could understand any of that, or experience, not even understand, but just experience any of that when I was younger. I think some of it is stuff you can only get because you live a bit longer, and you have to life feels like a process of letting go. You start off so strong. You start off so sure and so determined and so desperate, that all this stuff is going to happen in your life. You've got all this time, and this is what's going to happen in your life. And then life actually happens, and you're like, oh yeah, I didn't have as much control over that as I thought.
Yeah, well, so much of what we do is designed to help us pretend we have control over things that we can't possibly control. And I find it really interesting, sort of, obviously I'm British as well. And part of what drew me to the book was that sort of clash of cultures a little bit. There's a line in the book that says, "I'm British. When faced with a shared public space, it is the inclination of my people to keep our heads down and pretend that no one else exists." And it reminds me, so I was invited a few years ago to speak at a conference on social isolation. And while I was waiting to speak, I stood there looking at my phone, pretending to be on Facebook so I didn't have to talk to anybody else in the room. And it's like I wondered whether something like bluegrass could have been an English music if we're the right kind of society for it. Because you talk really beautifully in the book about how common intergenerational friendships are in the places you visited in America, for example, which is not necessarily a common thing in Britain. And I sort of wondered if a nation like ours could have produced bluegrass. I sort of feel like maybe not.
No, I do think that, talking about a personal journey, the best thing that happened to me, from just going there to learn bluegrass was that I discovered a totally different society and way of living, and one that really suited me. And I wouldn't have known that suited me because I've, grown up in Britain, and I'm very used to being very reserved, and especially as a Londoner, it's even worse in a big city. And actually being the American version of myself, if such a thing can be said, or the Southern version or whatever it was, I just loved it. I got so much out of the openness and the hospitality culture, and the kind of come as you are stuff. Everything about that was so new and very, very appealing to me, and I felt so deeply happy in a sort of content with where I was and where I was at, and having been a city girl, contentment would not ever have come in, my top 5 list of emotions at any stage in the previous sort of decade of my life. Exhilaration and, sense of achievement, yes, blah, blah, but just contentment and just to be, not even to be who I am, just to be. That was something I only really learned from being in the South, and where things move a bit slower. People don't care how you dress, and the doors are open, and it's just, that was a really special experience. And I have to say, talking about social isolation, one that I have missed hugely since the start of lockdown, because I was in the lucky position, having made these friends and doing a job where I can often work from a different country. I was in the fortunate position where I could go and be in North Carolina, at least once a year generally, and find this other mode of living, this other mode of being. And being cut off from it for 3 years has been it's been hard, because I know that it exists. I know there's a version of me out there in parallel multiverse world that is much more relaxed and much more open and can hang. That was I think those are big words that I learned in the South. I mean, there were so many, but one of them, the concept of a hang, was just that does not exist as far as I know. Not in my life in the UK. There's nothing is that unscheduled. Nothing is that easygoing here.
Mm-hmm. And also one that leads on to something I was going to ask you about, actually, is just moving to a place where you ended up not being a tourist. You ended up, being to some extent a local and meeting people that mean a lot to you. And how easy is it then to write a book where you talk about those people, knowing they're going to read it and knowing that you need to be able to say stuff that's going to entertain us as readers, and sometimes that's going to have to require you to be a little bit judgmental. It must. I don't know how you balance that.
It was. Oh no, that is hard. I mean, that is hard. Luckily, my best friends over there, the people I write about in the book, like Trevor, and Andrew and Carrie. I mean, luckily, I was so besotted with them, that my heart was so full of love for these people that I could, that nothing that I wrote about them would have come out badly, because, I think, for a long while, I just had them up on a massive pedestal, really. But yes, the danger of being the observer and having been invited into something, but then yes, essentially at the end being like, but I'm still going to write this book where I'm the outsider and I'm the observer. It was tricky, and I really did have to think about it, and I did have to. I think kindness was, the main watchword. I don't think I always got it right, but I think that because I had such a good experience and I had felt so enthusiastic and optimistic, that even the things that I struggled with, be it the Trumpian politics or the right, very, very, hellfire versions of Christianity that I came across, that I wrote about those things, and I documented what I felt, or what I observed and what I felt. But I tried to do it in a way that would still honor the people who were into those scenes, whichever they, politically or religiously, and tried to give their words, and not to judge their words, just to give their words as they were. And it is very interesting, because since I wrote that book, when I was there for the, that was the first year of Trump's presidency. And so a lot of the people that, as I say, I was really good friends with, sort of horrified by what was happening in their national politics, really horrified, deeply embarrassed that someone like President Trump could be their statesperson. And so I got a lot of apology, I encountered a lot of bluegrassers who thought he was the greatest thing since sliced bread, but I also got a lot of apologies on Trump's behalf. And I found that fascinating, living in a place that felt like it was wrestling so hard with who it was and what was going on there. And then unfortunately, in the years since, which had already been presaged by the Brexit vote, but it has landed a lot harder since then. The same thing has now happened in Britain, and I shouldn't have been surprised at all, because it was already happening in Europe, and there were plenty of European countries that were experiencing their own struggles with populism. But the fact that I'm now the person who's in the situation where she feels that as soon as she goes abroad, as I did recently, I just spent a month traveling around the European continent, actually, in 9 different countries. And I found myself apologizing for what's happening in Britain all the time. And so I think in some ways it was a good experience to have been through, to have witnessed it, I suppose, in a way there. It's helped me a little bit more to try not to get sucked into the culture wars that exist in Britain, and which are very easy to get sucked into, both as a kind of lefty liberal Londoner, but also as a journalist. I mean, journalism is just absolutely it's feeding on all this stuff. Our news networks and even our newspapers are running on outrage at the moment from either side of the divide. And while I am always tempted to be on the left side of that outrage, and I know that there's a danger of stoking it. And I also know from my time with bluegrass playing Trump supporters, who I've sat down with and picked with and had a really great time with, and have seen them with their families, have seen them with the community, have seen them just being really good human beings who happen to have taken up political stances I find baffling and abhorrent. I feel like it's taught me to really moderate my own response to what's happening across the culture divide in Britain now, because my instinct is that, I don't agree with anybody. I mean, I don't agree with people on the other side of the argument, but that doesn't mean that they're not deep down going to be really decent, fundamentally decent human beings, because that's what I found in the bluegrass community. Very, very, very few people in life are not fundamentally decent human beings, I think.
And I think there's something really beautiful in that, because I read the book again just before talking to you today. It was a while since I'd read it, so I wanted to read it again, and so some of it was fresh. And just like, you think about how polarised we are and how polarised we get, and how easy it is to surround yourself with people who think the same things as you do. And you sort of almost start from, are you one of us or one of them, before you get to know somebody. And the idea of turning up in a regular bluegrass jam, or going to a festival and sitting down with a bunch of strangers, and the first question you ask is, what instrument do you play and what tune should we start with? And so there's people I've been playing music with regularly for years. I've got no idea how most of them vote. They're all, like, in my experience, good, kind, honest, caring, interesting people I like playing music with. I don't know what their politics is, because we haven't talked about it. And being on Facebook groups full of bluegrass guitarists and chatting to people who, listen to this podcast, and it sort of doesn't matter. And politics does matter, but at the same time, it's really important to be reminded that mostly we're the same as each other, even if in some little bits that matter to us a lot, we're not. And that's just that idea of people sitting in a circle playing music, looking at each other like we're all the same, is a really important thing at the moment, I think.
Yeah, I think so. And, and most, there are some jam circles you sit in that are just like wacky, and that are, that become strangely competitive and rivalrous. just weird, peacocking exhibitionism. But mostly, most jams, the atmosphere will be encouraging. Most people are there to, they want the music to keep going. They want this tune to hold up. and in order to keep a tune going, you kind of all have to buy into it. And there's that like there's that guitarist who, sorry, I don't know why I picked on guitarist just because you're one, but who can't nail a solo, or who slows down, who can't keep up with the bass or whatever it is. Yes. And but that's part of the deal. That is just part of the deal. This is community. This is what, I think the better versions that I see of religion, this is what religion is sort of teaches, that, the best versions of that is that everyone's, that we are here to look after everyone, that we are an agent of welfare. And that means everyone needs to be equally looked after and valued and given their human dignity. And, I think that's where the joy is, really. The joy is in coming together with people. There's no joy in the opposite of that. We know that. Like, it doesn't make, I've never seen it make anybody happy, conflict.
And that is sort of, I'm not talking about conflicts, but that idea of people getting together, and that's where the value is. There's a point in the book where you sort of fairly early on where you rock up and you're hoping just to stand around and watch and learn from people by not having to chuck yourself into it. And the chucking yourself into it was the thing, as it always is. However many excuses we can give ourselves while standing around on the edge is good for whatever reason. That just the getting on in and doing it, being with people, doing a thing together. That's like in every instance what it's about, really. Yeah.
And so often it's fear that stops us, isn't it? So often it's like fear of embarrassment, or fear of social rejection, or whatever it is. And I've got to say, oh gosh, no, it's going to be really hard to say this without sounding like an arrogant idiot. There's no way around this. I've started this sentence now, but it was the thing I learned about myself from this whole experience, was that that I'm sort of, there are certain regards in which I am much more fearless than I ever knew, and travel was what taught me that, really. Sort of just to, I don't mind getting on a plane and going somewhere and knowing no one, because that's sort of the point. I will meet people and they will become my friends. And it was only really ever getting home and talking to my friends back here, and they would say, "You're so brave, Emma, so brave." And I'd be like, "I'm not brave, because bravery is overcoming fear." And I didn't have to because there was no fear involved. So that was another nice thing that has really genuinely changed my life. I mean, I've written 3 books now. One was about cricket, and my obsession with cricket as a teenager. And the other one I wrote during lockdown, that was a kind of more memoir-y sort of thing. But the Bluegrass book is the one that has really genuinely, like, actually changed my life. It taught me stuff about myself that I could have gone another 10 to 20 years. Who knows, I could have maybe got to the end of my life and never known all that stuff about myself. I certainly wouldn't have walked out on a stable, well-paid, job at a national newspaper for anything else, if it hadn't been for this. And I wouldn't be, living the completely different life that I'm living now. So, so thanks, Wayfaring Stranger. Look what you did to me.
But I think that's glorious, because, that idea that it might have started off with Mumford & Sons that isn't really bluegrass at all. But we've all got our starting points with this. Some people come in through "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" Some people will come in through Billy Strings, or, however you get in, we're all in. And that's just a lovely thing, to find a place that you didn't realise you belonged, that you do.
Yeah.
And I think that's lovely. And I'm sort of aware that we're kind of running out of time, so that's maybe a lovely positive note to end on. But it's
very happy. It's a very happy thought. I approve this message.
I mean, I could talk to you for hours more. There's it's been a joy. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. Yeah, it's lovely. I haven't got to chat to anybody about bluegrass for a little while. Well, yeah, since the last time that I discovered who actually, the other people in the cricket bluegrass Venn diagram, which turns out to be Johnny Flynn. So there are Robert McFarlane, the nature writer. He's also in the cricket bluegrass crossover. So it's always nice to find people who occupy that tiny space.
Well, try and drag a few more in. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Cool. I hope you enjoyed that one. That was really fun to do. I loved Emma's book, and I hope you will too. I'll put links in the show notes where you can go and find the book and Emma's website and various other bits and pieces. But yeah, have a great week. Back next time. Happy picking. Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins, making some of the finest guitars and mandolins in the world since the 1970s. Visit collingsguitars.com and find out why.